it requires a bigger thrust of liberalization, and particularly when it comes to Malaysia's integration into these global supply chains, which is really the critical core of its economy. The problem is that Malaysia's previous advantage, its labor cost advantage, has practically disappeared. And this kind of production has already shifted elsewhere, and what remains of it is going to shift elsewhere, to Vietnam, to Indonesia, in the future probably to India. And Malaysia, of course, has to go higher up the value chain. But that doesn't happen automatically, like manna descending from heaven. It has to happen with conscious policy choices, with improvements in policies and institutions. And the real challenge for Malaysia is to go higher value in these global value chains or supply chains, in services in particular. There is some room in higher end manufacturing, but like Singapore, that room is shrinking all the time. The key for Malaysia's future wealth is to do much better in inserting itself into these value chains in a whole range of services industries, because services, financial services, telecom services, the business services like consulting, legal services, accountancy, and transport and logistics are very much the glue of these value chains, and they account for more and more value in them all over the world. They really are critical. But these are precisely the areas that are cordoned off to a large extent from the world economy, part of the closed economy as opposed to the open economy within Malaysia's dual economy. And that leads me to my final points here. What implications does that have for trade policy as part of wider reforms in Malaysia? Well, the first point I want to make is very much about back to that Nike strategy. In other words, you can't wait for trade negotiations like the TPP. You can't rely on them. Often the politics of relying on doing things from the outside backfires because you don't build up the domestic constituency. It's important, it's vital to proceed on one's own to do these reforms. Now, there are a lot of domestic reforms which I briefly mentioned earlier, but I think they involve a lot of trade and investment reforms as well. These are not, for the most part, about tariffs. That job is mostly done. It's very much about domestic regulations in services and investment in particular. One could add the sensitive political issue of government procurement as well. So all of that, I think, should proceed on the unilateral track. And if some answer, well, that's politically impossible or very difficult, then my riposte would be that it's the job of ideas and others to make the case for that, to make it politically possible at some juncture. Let me then come to the world of trade negotiations, or what is called reciprocity, bargaining with others. As I said, the cart should not be pulled before the horse. This should not be the first imperative. It should be the unilateral track. But you can use trade negotiations and trade agreements to lock in or reinforce what you're already doing at home, and to send good signals to outsiders that you're open to business. In the WTO, Malaysia, unfortunately, has since the beginning of the Doha round, pursued a policy that's directly counter to its objective economic interests. It acts like a tin pot, backward, third world country, with the help of Martin Kor's Third World Network. And of course, Dr. Mahathir in his sunset days as Prime Minister, when he opposed in negotiations on investment in the WTO. Malaysia should act in a way that's more consonant with its trading and investment interests. And there are new coalitions in the WTO to liberalize services. That's happening outside the WTO, but there are other areas where Malaysia should be important and active, but isn't. APEC a few things that can be done. I won't dwell on that. With ASEAN and the ASEAN Economic Community, I think the job is not coming up with new visions and new blueprints, because ASEAN leaders seem to do that all the time, with actually very little intention or will to achieving them. That's part of the ASEAN way. The objective, I think, should be to fill in what's already there, and Malaysia should play its part there. Finally, let me come to these bilateral FTAs and the big negotiations that are on the go. Starting with RCEP, which is effectively led by China. It is probably going to be a very weak agreement, like other FTAs in this part of the world, and may not make that much difference. Malaysia is part of it, should be part of it, but that's probably not going to be the most important negotiation. The EU-Malaysia negotiations are in many ways more important, because they will require Malaysia to make more serious commitments. But the most important of all is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the US Trade Representative Mike Froman tells us in the Financial Times a few days ago is only a few months away from completion. In other words, it's coming to the end game. Now, there are lots of nasty things said about the TPP here in Malaysia by government supporters and opposition supporters. They're largely untrue. There are some real issues, for example, on intellectual property rights. But the key positive thing about the TPP is that it's a much more serious agreement, which does involve rules in areas like services and investment and, yes, government procurement, that actually help to open up economies to productive competition. And that's why I think, on balance, it's probably good news for Malaysia and should be taken seriously, because it could help reinforce what Malaysia should be doing at home in any case. I'll leave my comments about the TPP there. My concluding comments are really the following, and back to a broad canvas. When I think of markets and globalization, I think of them as a trinity, because they involve three aspects that I think are key. One is, of course, material welfare. There has never been an instrument that has delivered more people out in the world out of poverty and given them life chances than this thing called markets. Markets preferably as free as possible. The second advantage is politics. As I said before, it helps keep politics more honest. And in addition to that, it helps keeps the peace in international relations. That is what commerce does. The final point is very much about my title, which has two words in it, among others, and that's economic freedom. Because opening to markets is very much about the liberty of the individuals. The liberty of individuals is not just about politics and civic rights. It's very much about the day-to-day economic activity of individual human beings, from the very rich to the very poor. And I put what I have said specifically on Malaysia very much in that broad context and in the frame of that trinity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Salleh. Could you please remain on stage to join in the next session?